He stood on the prow of the war galley, the salt wind scraping across his face, and watched as King's Landing loomed ahead in the gray of early dawn. The city's walls rose from the shoreline like a jagged mouth, a testament to centuries of wealth and conflict. Stannis Baratheon, rightful king of Westeros by his own claim and by law, held his jaw rigid as they drew closer. Dawn stained the eastern sky, but a thin mist still clung to the river's surface, coiling about them like pale serpents. A hush had settled over the attacking fleet, for there was no longer the roar of wildfire or the beating drums of the Lannister horde. The shrieks of men drowning in green flame had at last been replaced by grim silence. He recalled the heat of the flames and the horrid screams when the defenders had unleashed their wildfire. The distant booms still reverberated in his ears as though they had seeped into his bones. Yet the men who still lived, those who had survived that hellish trap, had landed. They had forced open a breach in the city's defenses before the Tyrells could come to the rescue, before Joffrey Baratheon's men could rally anew. By some twist of fate and by the iron will of their commander, they had surged over the rubble. And in a single brutal push, the city's gate had buckled. A pinch of pride caught in Stannis' chest as he watched the battered remnants of his fleet drifting behind them. They had paid in blood and burnt flesh, but they had broken the defenders. His knights and sellswords shouted his name. His foot soldiers sang of the Red God and of the King in the narrow sea. On the war galley's upper deck, near where the ship's banner hung in tatters, Sir Roland Storm, one of his best men, stood with his sword upraised. Even from his vantage, Stannis could see the relief on Roland's sweat-streaked face. Today they had triumphed. Stannis turned, scanning the men around him. So many of their ships were drifting in ruin or listing dangerously with holes charred into their hulls. Yet, for all that, they had prevailed. The surviving vessels were enough to secure the mouth of the Blackwater. The Lannister fleet was in shambles. His ground forces had stormed ashore on both sides of the city, sacking outlying strongholds. The Gold Cloaks, leaderless and outnumbered, had either fled or bent the knee under duress. Parts of the city had all but exploded into chaos as word spread that the Lion was dethroned. With the dawn came the knowledge that the Red Keep itself remained the final bastion. Joffrey Baratheon and his mother, Cersei Lannister, were rumored to have retreated within its crimson walls, along with the Queen Regent's younger children and a handful of courtiers. Stannis watched King's Landing glimmer in the first orange wash of sun, the city that had once humiliated him. The stony columns of the Red Keep rose high above the slums of Flea Bottom, and he wondered how many hungry souls lived within those walls. He wondered, too, if they would prefer him as their king, or if they would whisper curses behind his back. He was no fool. He knew he did not inspire love. Renly had once been the charming brother, the beloved. But Renly was gone, a victim of sorcery, or so the rumors said. Stannis did not dwell on it. He would not indulge the ghosts of guilt. Davos Seaworth, the Onion Knight, was near the prow as well, bracing himself on the rail. His grizzled face had been shaped by hard years in the shadows of nobility, but there was a trace of awe in his eyes. Despite his loyalty, Davos could not hide the worry etched in the harsh lines of his mouth. Davos said in a hoarse whisper, "We've won the day, Your Grace." "Though I fear our losses," he trailed off. Stannis knew Davos's sons had manned some of the ships that perished in green fire. There had been so many bright plumes of flame upon the water, ships turning to ash, sailors boiled alive or hurled into the black depths. Such horrors would leave more scars than bodies. Stannis allowed himself a brief moment to rest a hand on Davos's shoulder. He was not gifted at offering comfort. All his life he had worn a brittle mantle of sternness. But Davos was different. Davos had been his friend, perhaps his only friend. "Take heart," said Stannis softly. "We will bury the dead. And those who remain, they fought as men possessed. For good reason, our cause was righteous. Now we need them still. We have a city to take." Davos's eyes shone with more sorrow than relief. "Yes, Your Grace." Stannis let his hand drop, and together they watched as the lead war galley slid past the ruined dock gates. The stone walls along the quay were scorched with black streaks from the earlier infernos. Bodies floated in the shallows, men in battered half-helms were dragging them onto splintered walkways. Farther along, Stannis saw groups of his soldiers pulling open storehouses, rummaging for supplies. He clenched his jaw in distaste. Looting was inevitable. He would have to restore order. Lest his men turn into beasts, they must remember whose city this now was, his. He ordered the ship moored, then disembarked with a retinue of knights and a handful of archers. Their boots squelched in slick ash and mud. Along the quay, the smell of cinders was thick, mingling with the stench of brine. Stannis did not pause to rest. The city would not wait. He mounted a horse brought to him by a nervous squire. His gauntlet hand tightened around the reins as he looked toward the looming shape of the Red Keep. It crouched like a monstrous sentinel, redstone blackened by distance, the battlements ringed with trembling banners. Somewhere within were the last foes who might keep him from the Iron Throne. He spoke curtly to his knights. "We move to the Mudgate, link with the ground forces who broke through. Then we ride to the keep. Joffrey's men will fight to protect him, but he has no hope." He cast his gaze about, ensuring they all saw his conviction. "We show no mercy to any who stand in open rebellion, but do not cut down innocents. We are no tyranny." A mutter of assent swept through them, though a few of his more bloodthirsty bannermen looked disappointed at the prospect of restraint. They would obey, or they would find themselves on the receiving end of Stannis' unyielding justice. Under the rising sun, their horses trotted through the city gates that had been battered in the night. Twisted metal lay scattered about from the gate's collapsed portcullis. Piles of rubble took up half the street. It was as if the city had been gashed open by giant claws. Dead men littered the ground, clad in gold cloaks or stiff tabards scorched black. Some had the fiery heart of the Lord of Light on their surcoats. Many more simply wore the colors of the Stormlands or the Crown. They passed watchfully through the lower city. Windows and doors had been shuttered or boarded up, but here and their ragged faces peered through cracks. Rumors of the city's fall must have spread quickly. The small folk had learned it was Stannis Baratheon, not the Lannisters, who held the gates. Some might cheer the name, others might spit at it. All would remain silent until the matter was decided. In the heavy hush, all that could be heard was the thud of hooves, the rattling of armor, and the occasional distant scream that spoke of looters or frightened citizens. Smoke still rose in patches where wildfire had ignited. The scorching had left great black smudges on the river's edge, but inside the city, random fires had been beaten out with frantic efforts, leaving only charred wreckage. Stannis could feel the grit in the air, the dust of broken stone, as he and his knights wound their way deeper. The Red Keep beckoned on the horizon, looming from its perch on Aegon's high hill. They were met at an intersection by a band of foot soldiers in dented armor. One carried the stag-and flame banner of House Baratheon as he knelt, panting, before the king. "Your Grace," said the man, his voice raw from hours of shouting, "the gold cloaks have broken. Some surrendered. Some scattered. Lord Tywin has not arrived. Word is that the Tyrell reinforcements are nowhere to be found." "Good," Stannis said curtly. "And the Red Keep? They're holding out for now. They'd closed the main gates up there." The King's Guard retreated inside. Stannis' gaze hardened. "King's Guard," he repeated, lips curling. "Then they protect a false king." He turned, urging his horse forward. His force wound through narrow streets toward the higher reaches of the city. More archers joined them, and Davos, guiding some foemen. Ser Axel Florent, clad in battered plate, rode up in a swirl of dust and began shouting about the progress near the Gate of the Gods. There, apparently, more gold cloaks had bent the knee. Stannis nodded sharply, acknowledging the news, but his real focus never wavered from his target. He had fought so many battles in his life. He had weathered the siege at Storm's End, starved near to death and yet refusing to yield. He had broken the iron fleets on the stepstones. He had survived the scorn of his elder brother, the mockery of the younger. All that remained, all that truly mattered, was that iron seat now within his reach. He would rule, not with love, but with justice. And in time, perhaps, the realm would find peace. He heard a horn echo across the rooftops. Ahead was the Red Keep's outer wall, looming above the sloping street. The portcullis was down, thick bars glinting. Soldiers in Lannister red still manned the battlements, though the standard of the Golden Lion hung limp. There was no sign of Tywin or any other relief force. The arrow loops bristled with archers, perhaps a final show of defiance. But how long could they hold out? Stannis signaled and his men fanned out. The swirl of dust and burnt air accompanied them as they dismounted. He let younger knights handle the siege details. A battering ram was being dragged up from lower in the city. Under normal circumstances, the Red Keep might have repelled attackers for weeks. But the rest of King's Landing was in Stannis' hands now. The Blackwater defenses were shattered, and so many Lannisters had died in the frenzy of wildfire or surrendered. The men behind those walls must know it was hopeless. Yet he did not expect them to simply open the gate and yield Joffrey. Pride, fear, and Lannister gold might still hold them. Or perhaps they would wait for a miracle that would never come. Stannis was done waiting. He looked to Davos, to Rollenstorm, to the rest. They saw his determination. The ram started its slow progress. Bowmen moved into position. Shields lifted. Archers, came the call, and a volley of arrows sipped up from Stannis' line. Then a sharper cry from the Red Keep's ramparts. Arrows from above whistled down, clattering against shields, biting into flesh. The men roared, surging forward. The ram crashed against the portcullis. He heard the squeal of metal. A second crash, then a volley of flaming arrows soared over the walls to fall among Stannis' men. The smell of burning pitch was immediate, but the attackers were prepared. A cluster of Stormland's men drenched the ram's timbers with water, beating at the flames. They kept going, determined to open the fortress that had defied them. Stannis stood back, letting the men do their work. He felt the weight of the moment pressing upon him like an iron gauntlet. Winning the city had taken a savage toll. Wildfire had nearly destroyed them. Fate had balanced on a knife's edge, but the prayers and resolve of his men, along with cunning by Ser Davos, had carried them forward. They had smashed Joffrey's men at the walls, spurred by the knowledge that the Tyrells' promised reinforcements had not arrived in time. Now, this final push. Again, the ram slammed forward with a thunderous crash, and this time the groan of steel was louder. The portcullis gave, sagging inward. Shouts of triumph thundered through the ranks. Another blow, a final heave, and the bars wrenched free, the gate bursting open. Stannis lifted Lightbringer, his sword, the steel catching glints of the morning light, an echo of the red and gold flame that lore said was the sword of a prophesied champion. Some believed the sword to be a mere symbol. Others said it was chosen by the Lord of Light. Stannis had begun to think of it as a reminder of his burden. Yet in that moment, it gleamed with the promise of victory. "Forward!" he shouted, and forward they went. Knights in battered tabards, foot soldiers bearing the stag in flame, archers with half-filled quivers, all rushed into the breach. The courtyard within was broad and paved in red stone. The Lannister men, or what remained of them, formed a desperate line. Stannis rushed with his men, Lightbringer raised high. Shields collided. Steel rang out. There, in the swirling chaos, a knight with a crimson cloak lunged at him, only to be struck aside by two of Stannis' men. Another tried to rise from the ground, his visor cracked, blood bubbling on his lips. The impetus of the charge forced them back. They clashed in that courtyard as the sun climbed higher, the clang of swords echoing off the tall red walls. Stannis moved with grim efficiency. Though he was no flamboyant warrior like his brother Renly, he had experience, a soldier's discipline. He parried a thrust, slashing across a Lannister shield, then pressed forward. The defenders stumbled, their lines fracturing. Arrows whistled overhead, men cried out, and the thunder of boots shook the courtyard as wave upon wave of Baratheon troops flooded in. At last, the Lannister men broke and fled across the yard, seeking refuge in the keep's inner bastions. Stannis pushed through them, men parting to clear his path. He was flanked by Ser Roland and a handful of loyal knights, each panting in the heated air. Smoke drifted from the ramparts. The keep's great doors lay just ahead. They were shut, locked from within, but some defenders still lingered outside, wounded or in shock. Stannis pointed his sword at the doors. "Break it down," he snapped. Even as his men approached with axes, one of the huge doors groaned. A second later, it slid open a fraction. From the dim interior, a figure emerged. A herald, it seemed, in blood-spattered finery. The man's face was chalk pale. He trembled, holding out his open palms. "Your Grace," the herald said, voice quavering. "We beg parley. Spare the women and children within, and the keep is yours. The King's Guard. They are uncertain how best to proceed." Stannis felt a bitter twist in his stomach. Joffrey's Kingsguard had never once shown any sign of retreat or caution. They must sense the hopelessness. "Open the door, lay down your arms, and you will be spared," Stannis declared, not raising his voice. "But the boy who calls himself King Joffrey must be delivered to me." The herald swallowed so hard Stannis could hear it. "Your Grace, he is but a child." "Surely a child who has ordered countless deaths," Stannis said. "He is no rightful king. Your last chance." For a heartbeat, the only sound was the crackle of distant flames and the panting of soldiers. Then, slowly, the herald stepped back as though crushed under an immense weight. The door opened further, revealing a handful of disheveled men in white cloaks and battered armor, the King's Guard, each with an expression of deep conflict. They had sworn vows to protect the king, but which king? By law, some might argue Stannis was rightful. By oaths, Joffrey was. But the realm seldom bent to easy truths. The men said not a word, offering only a curt nod. Stannis' knights rushed in, disarming them. The courtyard fell silent, save for the moans of the wounded. Step by step, Stannis ascended into the Red Keep. Its corridors were lit by torches that barely chased away the gloom. Each hallway echoed with distant sobs, the hush of terror. A few stray guards dropped their weapons at the sight of so many enemies. Others ran, boots slapping on the stone floors, disappearing into side passages. Eventually, Stannis found himself in the throne room antechamber, a vaulted space that reeked of incense and stale perfume. Before him were more cowering courtiers, ladies in rumpled gowns, and bleary-eyed lords who had once mocked his claim. Now, they shrank against columns or sank to their knees on the marble floor. He saw the fear in their eyes, how they bowed their heads as though expecting the sword. He would not stoop to slaughtering the kneeling, no matter how swiftly they had shifted their loyalties. They would face justice, not blind vengeance. He strode onward, passing through a set of tall doors until he reached the throne room itself, that vast chamber of pillars and vaulted ceilings. The iron throne perched at the far end upon a raised dais of steps. Its swords jutted like a tangle of knives. In the half-light, it seemed to leer at him. Fitting, he thought, that the seat forged by the fires of conquest should preside over so many centuries of blood. Standing at the foot of the dais was Queen Cersei Lannister, her golden hair disheveled around her pale face. She clutched the small hand of a dark-haired boy, Tommen, the younger son. Near them stood a trembling Sansa Stark, the northerner betrothed to Joffrey. Cersei's emerald eyes flashed with hate. "You dare," she hissed. "You dare bring your filth into my throne room." Stannis' gaze was hard as stone. "Your throne room," he echoed. "I think not." He glanced around, searching for Joffrey. He saw only a cluster of Lannister guards on the periphery, all weapons lowered in a show of surrender. Many of them wore wide-eyed expressions, uncertain of their fates. Then he saw Joffrey cowering behind a column. The boy king's face was streaked with tears and sweat. His crown was askew, jammed onto his flaxen hair. He looked no older than his 12 or 13 years, undone by fear. Gone was the shrill cruelty and swagger that had terrorized the city. In its place, a trembling child. Stannis advanced, Lightbringer still in hand, though he held it at his side, tip low. "Joffrey Baratheon," he said, voice echoing in the silent hall. "No. Joffrey Waters, bastard of incest, if the rumors are true. The time for pretense is over." Joffrey gave a high, thin whimper. You have no right. The throne is mine by inheritance. Grandfather will come." "Your grandfather is not here," Stannis replied coldly. "Nor are the Tyrells or any other to save you." He studied Joffrey's tear-streaked face. Part of him wanted to feel pity. The rest of him remembered the tales of Ned Stark's beheading, the butchery of Robert's bastards, the torment inflicted upon Sansa Stark. The line between child and monster was thin here, but he did not flinch from the duty that had fallen upon him. "I gave your men a chance to surrender. They have surrendered. So you shall yield or you shall die." A strangled sob broke from Cersei. "He is my son. You have no notion of what you do." She looked around desperately but found no assistance. The king's guard lowered their eyes. None stepped forward. They knew the war was over. The Red Keep had fallen. Stannis leveled a flat gaze at Cersei. "Your son is not the rightful king. He has spilled innocent blood and misused the royal power. The realm will see justice done." Cersei's lips quivered with rage, but she said nothing, only trembled as her grip tightened on Tommen's small hand. The younger boy's face was pale, eyes wet. Joffrey turned in desperation to Sansa. "Kneel for me," he spat, half sobbing. Tell him you are mine, he cannot do this." The girl, tall for her age, with auburn hair matted from tears, gazed at him in horror. She did not move. Her parted lips seemed to shape words that would not. "Come." Stannis barked an order, "Take the boy into custody." The battered men of the king's guard stepped toward Joffrey, who let out a ragged cry. He tried to scramble back, but a mailed fist closed around his arm, pulling him forward. He thrashed like a cornered animal, shrieking something incoherent. Cersei held in fury but was seized by two soldiers before she could run at Stannis. Tommen tried to cling to her, wailing, and a guard gently pried him away. In the hush that followed, Stannis stood before the Iron Throne, eyeing the twisted swords. The watchers, lords, ladies, guards stared, fearful. He could almost sense the ghost of his brother Robert, of Ned Stark, of all those who had fought for or against the Targaryens in years gone by. The throne was a symbol as much as a seat, an embodiment of the realm's power. Lightbringer felt cool in his hand now, its fire dim in the pale morning light filtering through the high windows. The Red Keep was his. King's Landing was his. The Seven Kingdoms might not yet be wholly subdued, but the capital was. And soon, the lords of Westeros would have no choice but to bend the knee or face the same wrath he had unleashed on the Lannisters. He ascended the dais. Each step resounded like a drumbeat. Then he stood before the Iron Throne. Its metalwork glinted and the air around it was faintly chill. With a grim, measured motion, he turned and seated himself upon it, the steel biting at his back through the thick cloth and mail. He released a breath he did not know he had been holding. The courtiers and soldiers who had witnessed that ascension knelt or bowed their heads, though a few stared with a flicker of fear. In the distance, Stannis could still hear the cries of the wounded beyond the walls, the clang of weapons striking final blows. War had come at a heavy price, but this day, this hour, was his. He did not luxuriate in the moment. Stannis rested Lightbringer across his lap and glanced at Davos Seaworth, who stood near the dais, gaunt from loss but unwavering. A silent understanding passed between them. The realm was not truly at peace. This was but the start. Many would contest or resent him. The Tyrells, the remains of the Lannisters, the North in turmoil, the Iron-born raiding, the Tullus uncertain. But this seat was the rightful place of Robert's legitimate heir of House Baratheon. Let them challenge him if they dared. Stannis's gaze swept over the cowering figures. He spoke, his voice echoing. I am Stannis of the House Baratheon, the first of my name, King of the Undulls and the Rhoynar and the First Men, Lord of the Seven Kingdoms, Protector of the Realm. Those who would do homage may rise. Those who remain defiant will face the penalty for treason. A rustle swept the throne room as courtiers bowed lower. A few stammered out, Your Grace. Cersei spat, usurper, though quietly, her voice ragged. No one echoed her. Stannis felt a hollowness in his chest. Victory without glory, a satisfaction that felt more like the savage necessity of finishing a hunt. His face was stony as he turned to the king's guard. Take Joffrey Baratheon to a secure cell. The same for the boy Tommen. Let no harm come to them until I give the word. Place Cersei Lannister under guard. She shall also be held to account for her crimes. The men hurried to obey. The hall was thick with tension and the watchers parted to allow the royal captives to be led away. Some were sobbing, others stared numbly. Stannis thought of the small folk outside, of the half-destroyed ships and the charred bodies on the river. This was not a joyous victory. This was a duty performed. In the swirl of confusion that followed, one of Stannis's knights strode forward and fell to a knee, breathless. Your Grace, men are calling for you outside, citizens, the hungry, the wounded. They demand to know if there will be a reckoning or if we shall keep order. There is talk of looting. The gold cloaks are scattered. We need your guidance. Stannis rose, the cold metal of the throne swords scraping at his back. They shall have order. Sound the horns. Let it be known, King Stannis has taken the city. Anyone bearing arms against the crown will be seized and tried. I will not suffer anarchy in these streets. He paused, lips pressed thin. Ser Davos, you will oversee the distribution of food stores. Make it known that the royal granaries now serve the people as my brother Robert intended. But keep watch for thieves. There are to be no roving bands of looters. Anyone caught raping or pillaging is to be shown the king's justice. Davos bowed deeply, though his expression was overshadowed by an unspoken anxiety. So many starving mouths, so few supplies. But the man would do his best. Stannis stepped down from the dais, the clang of his boots on stone sounding final. The hush in the throne room broke as a swirl of conversation, fear, and uncertain relief rippled among those present. Escorted by knights, Stannis moved back through the corridors that led outside. Along the way, they passed abandoned chambers with shattered furniture, overturned candelabras, and scattered draperies. The Red Keep showed signs of a last, desperate attempt to protect the Boy King. And now that boy was a prisoner in his own castle. Stannis felt no triumph in it. Only a heavy sense that events had reached a pivot in Westeros. The old regime was broken. In its place stood a cold man with a relentless cause. Emerging into the courtyard, the sunlight blinded him momentarily. Outside the gates, King's Landing stretched out, a city of dust and ruin in some quarters, still standing in others. Tattered banners hung from walls, the crest of House Lannister drooping like a dead thing. Banners of the Stag Flame had begun to appear, carried by triumphant soldiers. Yet the jeers and curses of the city's populace could be heard, mingled with some tentative cheers. The folk were uncertain, battered by war, and the specter of hunger loomed over them. Stannis lifted a hand to shield his eyes from the glare, scanning the crowds. They parted in waves, letting the armed men pass. A hush spread at the sight of him. He walked onward, flanked by a line of knights who kept the crowd at bay. His presence alone, the stern mask of a proven warrior and king, silenced most. Some spat or cursed, but they did not dare approach. Others called out for bread. A mother with a starving child cried for mercy while an old man shouted thanks that the Lannisters were gone. The city's many voices swirled around him like cawing gulls. He kept his silence, forging forward. He had to find a place to establish his seat within the Red Keep to set up the foundations of new rule. He would need to consider the council. Who would serve as hand? Davos had earned that right 100 times over, but Davos was no highborn. It would be a scandal among the nobility to name him. Would Stannis yield to that scandal, or would he follow his own sense of justice? He had not decided. Ahead, in the higher wards behind the castle, another wave of battered troops appeared, men bearing the sigils of various minor lords sworn to Dragonstone. They had fought valiantly, pressing the advantage in the final assault. One among them, a knight with half his helm missing, cheered, "Long live King Stannis." The shout echoed from a few throats. Stannis paused, letting them see him, letting them know that, for better or worse, the city was under his control. Then he strode onward, heading to the battlements that overlooked Blackwater Bay. Once there, he gazed down upon the battered remains of his fleet. A dozen hulks were still burning or sinking, while others drifted aimlessly with blackened sails. War galleys bobbed near the docks, men busily clearing wreckage. His casualties would be staggering. But the city was taken. He found it difficult to draw comfort from that. Perhaps the relief was overshadowed by the knowledge that the realm would not simply fall into line. But he reminded himself that the greatest obstacle, King's Landing and the Lannister hold on the throne, had been removed. He was the king now, by victory and by right. Let the other lords muster if they dared. If the Tyrells came, they would find the gates barred by his men. If the North marched, well, they had their own troubles in the War of the Five Kings. The Greyjoys might stir in the west, but they would not claim the Iron Throne. He thought of Melisandre, the Red Priestess, who had spoken of visions in the flames. She would claim credit for this victory, no doubt, and speak of Azor, a High Reborn. Stannis felt the steel of the battlements edge under his fingers. He did not know if he believed in such prophecies. Yet, the truth was plain, the city was his. He would press forward. The future of Westeros would be shaped by his hand. He turned from the sea, from the swirling smoke and the wreckage, and looked back at the labyrinth of streets within the walls. The houses, hovels, and manors alike would soon learn to live under his rule. A new set of laws, a new king's justice. If they were wise, they would heed it. The city had borne witness to the horrors of war. Perhaps that alone would quiet them long enough to let order take root. Stannis Baratheon let out a measured breath. He had yearned for this moment, for this seat of power, ever since he knew the truth about Joffrey's parentage. He had paid for it in blood, his own, his men's, and his enemies. Robert's seat was empty, and now Stannis filled it, a joyless man on a seat of swords. If the realm needed a strong, lawful hand, they had it. At last, the throne was his. But the burdens that came with it were only beginning. He turned away, the cloak of black and red swirling about him, Lightbringer sheathed at his hip. He would hold counsel, pass judgment, and see to the city's needs. He would root out any last pockets of Lannister resistance. The wheel of power had turned, and House Baratheon now sat astride it. Stannis had no illusions that the realm's lords would meekly submit without further bloodshed. But he did not shrink from the looming storm. He was Stannis, king of Westeros, and he would never bend. He turned away, stepping down from the battlements. The wind off Blackwater Bay swept at the ragged edges of his cloak, stirring the acrid smell of smoke that clung to the Red Keep stones. Around him, the courtyard was alive with motion, his soldiers busy clearing debris, binding the wounds of the injured, corralling prisoners. The city beyond the castle walls seemed quieter now, though not by much. King's Landing was too vast for a single hush to settle everywhere at once. But the frenetic panic of battle had subsided. What rose in its place was a low, rolling mutter of uncertainty. The people knew a new king held their fates in his gauntlet hands. A trio of knights hurried up to Stannis, each bowing low. One was Ser Roland Storm, bastard of the Swan family, breathing heavily from exertion. Another was a lesser Florent cousin, his cheek bandaged, dried blood marring the cloth. The third was an older knight named Ser Justin Massey, who had proven himself loyal through the final push. They murmured quick salutes, then Ser Roland spoke. "Your Grace, we secured most of the Red Keep's lower corridors. The Queen's chambers were empty. She must have been in the throne room when you took her." He hesitated. "There's no sign of the imp, Tyrion Lannister. Some say he was badly wounded in the fighting at the Mudgate. Others claim he retreated." Stannis' mouth set in a grim line. Tyrion Lannister's cunning had nearly destroyed his fleet with that trick of wildfire. Had the Blackwater current not shifted, had Davos and the others not found ways through the Green Inferno, the city would still belong to the Lannisters. Tyrion was dangerous. Let the man's wits be caged or ended. Hunt for him, Stannis commanded. If he's alive and skulking about, I want him found. There will be no uncertain threats within these walls. Yes, your grace, said Ser Roland. We've posted men at all sally ports. If he remains in the keep or the city, we'll smoke him out. Stannis dismissed them with a curt nod. Their footsteps retreated across the paving stones. He closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of exhaustion settle on him like lead. He had not rested in over a day. The confrontation, the final breach, had begun before midnight, and the city had fallen during the cold hours of dawn. Now the sun was high, glaring. War was never neat. Even in victory, there was the stench of rot and smoke, the screams of the dying. He reminded himself that no matter how weary he was, a king could not pause for sleep when the realm demanded order. If he wished to hold the throne, the labor must begin at once. He found Davos Seaworth in an inner courtyard, overseeing a chaotic attempt at quartering the city's huge stocks of grain. Soldiers stood guard while frightened servants lugged sacks in trembling arms. Citizens pressed in from every side, ignoring the reek of death and smoke in their desperation. More than once, a barbed shout rang out, "Traitors! Or bread! Or burn them!" The chaos was enough to make some men weep. But Davos, though still ghost-pale with grief and exhaustion, directed them with a firm voice. Stannis joined him, speaking softly. "We cannot feed them all at once. The granaries hold only so much. Use the storehouses seized from the Lannisters. Secure them from looters. Then distribute carefully. I will not have riots." Davos inclined his head, worry lines etched into his brow. "Your Grace, many are desperate. They say they've not eaten a full meal in weeks. Lord Tywin had ordered rations tightened. Then the war came. We might not have enough for all." Stannis's mouth tightened. "Do what you must. If we find the wealthy hoarding, or if there are hidden reserves, we'll seize them and see them given out in the king's name. I will not let the city starve." He paused, his voice dropping. "Your sons, do you have further word?" For a moment, grief flickered across the Onion Knight's weathered features. "No, your grace," he said softly. "Mathos and the others, some were lost in the wildfire. I'm told the bodies cannot be retrieved." He swallowed, pressing his lips together. "But we must look forward." Stannis placed a heavy hand on Davos's shoulder. Though the gesture was awkward, his concern was real. "They died for a cause that I hold dear. I grieve with you, Davos." His tone was stony but not unfeeling. "We shall build a monument for all who fell once the city is under control." Davos bowed his head in thanks, though his eyes glistened with unshed tears. "We serve at your pleasure." My sons understood that. Drawing a shaky breath, he steeled himself. "I'll see to the rations." Stannis nodded and left him to the grim work. Crossing the courtyard, he beckoned another group of soldiers and set them to guard halls in the keep, rooting out any remainder of Lannister men who might be in hiding or gathering for a last stand. The war had taught him never to underestimate a cornered foe. He sent a messenger to gather those knights and lords who had pinned his banner to their breasts: Ser Roland Storm, Axel Florent, Davos, Justin Massey, and others of rank. They would form the nucleus of his new ruling council. Until the city was stable, he needed them close. Order would be hammered out in a matter of hours, not days, because King's Landing was too large and fractious to leave rudderless. The messenger returned, leading the men up into a suite of chambers near the royal apartments. Stannis had chosen these rooms because they were away from the reek of blood in the throne room and close to the main corridors. The king took a seat at a long table carved of heavy oak. The men who arrived were streaked with sweat and grime, some with dried blood on their cloaks. Yet each bowed solemnly, calling him Your Grace. Stannis wasted no time. "We have the city. The Lannister hold is broken, but the cost was high. We must ensure that those who remain loyal to the boy Joffrey do not spark rebellion. The gold cloaks, how many now swear to me?" Ser Axel Florent, a heavy-set man with a patchy beard, stepped forward. "Your Grace, most have changed their cloaks soon as they saw your banners. They marched home from the walls in disarray. Perhaps a third are dead from the battle or from the wildfire. Another handful fled, but near 2,000 remain, and they're bending the knee in droves." "Good," Stannis said. "They will be reorganized under new officers. If any among them have shown particular cruelty, I want to know. We cannot simply ignore the past. But we need a city watch. There's no sense in tearing it down only to rebuild from nothing." Several knights murmured agreement. Ser Roland, Stannis continued, "Take a party to the Lion Gate. Secure it properly. Raise my banners and dismiss or detain any Lannister loyalists. Also dispatch patrols to quell looters." Ser Roland bowed and departed without hesitation. Stannis turned his gaze on Justin Massey. "Ser Justin, you will handle the outer gates, Gate of the Gods, Old Gate, Dragon Gate. Postmen with clear instructions that no one leaves unless we wish it. I do not want spies or foes slipping out under cover of chaos. Intercept any ravens leaving the city as well if such a thing is still possible. The Lannisters must not communicate with Lord Tywin. Ser Justin pressed a hand to his breastplate. At once, your grace. Soon, only a handful remained in the makeshift council chamber, Davos, Axel Florent, and a pair of lesser lords from the Stormlands. Stannis tapped his fingers on the table. Where's Melisandre? He glanced around, though a prickle of unease went through him. She had not been at his side in the battle itself. She had stayed behind on one of the ships, or so he had heard, chanting her prayers as the city burned. No one had an immediate answer. At last, one of the lesser lords, a man named Tristan Sunglass, cleared his throat. I last saw the Red Woman at dawn, your grace, near the walls. She was chanting. She said the flames would purify the wicked. I do not know where she is now. Stannis's jaw tightened. The Red Priestess had insisted this victory would be destined by the Lord of Light. Perhaps she thought to vanish until the hour of triumph, to reappear in a swirl of prophecy. He could not dwell on it. There was too much to be done. We will find her in time, he said curtly. If she is wise, she will be in the castle by nightfall. Now, Axel, see to it that ravens are sent to every corner of the realm. Let them bear the news. Stannis Baratheon has claimed the Iron Throne. Joffrey is in custody. The city has surrendered. Those who will not bend the knee must be prepared to face the same fate. Yes, your grace, Axel said, though his eyes shone with ambition. And perhaps you would like to announce terms for the other major houses? It might be wise to send particularly gracious messages to those who might join us. Graciousness, Stannis muttered. I will not beg for their loyalty. They should already have offered it. Yet, yes, carefully worded letters might forestall further bloodshed. Start with the Tullus, the Arryns, and the remnants of the Baratheon loyalists who once followed Renly. Also, the Martells in Dorne, though they have little reason to love the Lannisters. And watch for the Tyrells. We do not know if their host still gathers near the Rose Road. They were rumored to be marching to relieve the city, Axel ventured. But they did not arrive in time. Stannis's mouth curved in a humorless line. Then they have wasted men, horses, and coin on a lost cause. If they come now, we will be our. Edie. He rose from his seat, tiredness radiating in every muscle. We reconvene at sunset. By then, each of you must have your tasks completed. And do not forget to stabilize the city. We cannot rule ruins alone. They bowed, and he strode from the chamber, Lightbringer slapping lightly against his hip. Outside the door, a scattering of courtiers stood like anxious cattle, eyes darting. The smell of sweat, blood, and old perfume clung to them in equal measure. They parted in silence as he passed. He made for the royal apartments. The corridors here were more richly adorned with embroidered hangings and plush carpets, though many were torn or stained in the night's frenzy. The hush was profound. At intervals, small folk servants cowered in corners, uncertain of whether they should run or serve. Stannis barely spared them a glance. He came to a wide set of double doors guarded by two of his men. Within was the Queen's Solar, a space once belonging to Cersei. She had been taken away to a secure tower cell hours ago, her furious protests echoing after them. Stannis let out a short breath, remembering the vitriol in her eyes. She was dangerous in her own right, cunning and unpredictable. For the time being, though, she could do little harm, locked away with no allies. He entered the Solar. The chamber was lit by the glow of midday sun streaming through tall windows. Mirrors lined the walls, and scattered about were small items of vanity, combs, perfume bottles, jewels. All had been rifled through by men searching for hidden compartments or weapons. The place looked as though a storm had swept through. A young steward approached, bowing so low he nearly toppled. Your Grace, the bedchamber is, well, some of the valuables have been taken. Not by us, he added hastily, but by the Queen's retinue when they fled, or by looters. Stannis waved a dismissive hand. I care nothing for her baubles. Remove anything of practical worth to the crown. Leave the rest. He paused. Where's the Stark girl? Sansa Stark had been in the throne room, trembling when Stannis had taken Joffrey. He remembered her wide blue eyes. She was led away under guard to her own chambers, I believe. The guards were told to watch her. She's apparently done no wrong, but some might see her as a hostage or a traitor since she was betrothed to Joffrey. The steward swallowed. Lord Stark's daughter, she is. Some men speak of her father's loyalty to you, your grace. Others recall she's been captive to the Lannisters. Stannis exhaled slowly, recalling Ned Stark's honorable face, the man who had tried to warn Robert of the Lannisters' treachery. Stark had died a traitor's death at Joffrey's command, an abomination of justice if ever there was one. She is a child and no traitor. Let no harm come to her. We'll decide her fate soon. She is the key to the north in some ways. He turned to one of his knights stationed in the solar. Take me to her chambers. A moment later, he was being led through connecting corridors and up a short stair. 2 guards stood before a set of doors inlaid with pale wood. They saluted as the king approached. Stannis motioned for them to open the door. They did, revealing a sunlit sitting area with a single window that overlooked the Blackwater. The air smelled of lavender, though it was undercut by the tang of smoke. Sansa Stark stood by a table, wringing her hands. She jumped when the door opened, her face going pale. She sank into a curtsy so low that her auburn hair almost brushed the floor. Your Grace, she whispered. He stepped inside and the guards closed the door behind him, remaining outside. Stannis studied the girl's face. She was taller than he expected, perhaps 15. Her eyes were red-rimmed from weeping and her posture quivered with tension. Rise, he said quietly. She obeyed, hands clasped before her. He considered her, remembering fleetingly that the North was at war. Her brother Robb Stark had been declared king in the North. If Stannis were to unite the 7 kingdoms under his rule, the North must be brought to heel. Yet he also remembered how Ned Stark had tried to do right by the crown. The conflict pressed upon Stannis' mind. The city is ours, he said, his voice flat. Joffrey is taken. You need not fear him. But you are still a guest of the crown. We will treat you fairly, yet you must remain within the keep. She bowed her head, a trembling exhalation escaping her lips. Thank you, your grace. I have only ever wanted to go home. He hesitated. The truth was that the Stark family had no love for him, nor any reason to kneel, not after Robert's death and Ned Stark's execution. But the girl was innocent in all of that. Stannis recognized a possible advantage here, though it felt cold to view it that way. I cannot promise your freedom yet, he said, measuring each word. Your brother calls himself king in the North, a direct challenge to my rule. We shall see if negotiations are possible. For now, you are under my protection. You have my word that no harm will come to you. Her eyes darted up, searching his face. She seemed to want to believe him. I am grateful, your grace. I only prayed for the fighting to end, that no more blood would be spilled. His lips compressed. He had seen enough blood spilled to fill a sea. Remain in your chambers. Do not stray without leave. My men will see to your needs. He studied her once more. If you have cause for complaint or fear, send word through the guards. I will not tolerate any assault upon you. That is my law. She nodded, tears threatening to spill. Yes, your grace. He left her there, stepping into the hall with a hollow feeling in his chest. It was easier to face Lannister swords than the gaze of an innocent who had been used as a pawn by all sides. But such was the Game of Thrones, or so the realm's cunning lords called it. Stannis had no patience for the game, though it had ensnared him all the same. He descended back to the courtyard. The sun was swinging westward now, beating down with a punishing heat that set the air to shimmering over blood-stained stones. Soldiers marched to and fro, and the cries of the wounded mingled with the desperate pleas of those seeking water or mercy. He spied a line of prisoners, 12 or so men, including a couple of highborn pages and squires. They were being corralled under guard, presumably awaiting judgment. Stannis scanned the group and recognized one face, Lancel Lannister, cousin to Cersei, with a bandage around his shoulder and a hastily stitched gash across his cheek. The youth was pale, trembling, hair plastered to his forehead with sweat. He looked up at Stannis with a mixture of dread and pleading. Sire, Lancel stammered. I surrender to your justice. I beg mercy. I was only serving the crown. Stannis advanced, resting a hand on the hilt of Lightbringer. The crown you served was false. Where's your father? Kevin Lannister, he was not in the city. I do not know where, perhaps with Lord Tywin. He swallowed hard. But I have nothing to do with him. I swear I was only following orders. A twist of disgust crossed Stannis' features. He had little sympathy for Lannister kin, but this one was barely more than a boy, not much older than Joffrey. Lancel had been rumored to be entangled with Cersei in some manner, but that was hearsay. Still, he could not simply release the lad. Let the realm see that those who served the Lannisters face consequences. Place him in a secure cell, Stannis ordered. He shall remain there until I see fit to judge him. The rest, likewise, unless there is any immediate danger to their health. A guard saluted, then yanked Lancel by the arm, forcing him along. Another prisoner choked back a sob, while still another tried to protest innocence. Stannis hardly heard them. He felt the day wearing on him as if he were dragging a millstone by the neck. But there was no respite for a king. He climbed the steps once more, heading toward the throne room. Word had spread that Stannis Baratheon now sat the Iron Throne, and lords and knights trickled in to bend the knee or ask for mercy. He would have to receive them. It was not a task he desired, but it was the way of things. A new king must confirm titles, restore or remove privileges, proclaim his justice. And any who refused to bend would pay the price. Upon entering the throne room, he found it brighter now than in the morning, with more torches lit and rays of afternoon sun spilling through high windows. The space had been hastily cleaned of the worst of the blood and debris, though faint stains remained upon the marble floor. The Iron Throne loomed at the far end, the swords of Aegon's conquest fused in a jagged mass. Banners bearing the crowned stag of House Baratheon, ringed by the fiery heart of the Lord of Light, had been unfurled along the walls, replacing the Lion of Lannister. A line of men was already forming before the dais. Some were battered Stormland lords. Some were city dignitaries, bailiffs, guild masters, lesser notables who survived. A handful were foreign merchants, wide-eyed with fear, hoping to salvage their business. Stannis walked up the steps and seated himself upon the Iron Throne with quiet resolve, ignoring the bite of metal in his back. Davos stood at the foot of the dais on his left, a living reminder of the price paid for this seat, and Axel Florent took a position on his right, quill in hand to record judgments. For a moment, none dared speak. The hush was absolute. At length, Stannis said, his voice echoing in the vaulted hall, "Come forward. Be heard. I will dispense justice and receive oaths." The first to approach was the High Septon, though he was a wary, pinch-faced man, trembling in soiled robes. Stannis recognized him vaguely, remembering he was chosen after the previous High Septon died in suspicious circumstances. The faith of the Seven had been in the Lannisters' pocket, more or less. Now the High Septon bowed low. "Your Grace," he quavered. "May the Seven," he paused, uncertain, remembering that Stannis had espoused the Lord of Light. I pray for peace. The great September was struck by some of the fighting. The people need hope. Please, your Grace, have mercy on us." Stannis regarded him with cold eyes. The man's hypocrisy was well known. He had bent to Joffrey without question. "You speak of mercy, but showed little to those who questioned the Lannisters' tyranny. Still, I do not mean to war on your faith. Serve the city. Keep your sept open for worship. But know that if you conspire against me, you will answer for it." The High Septon bobbed his head so violently it seemed he might collapse. Then he backed away, relief warring with terror on his face. Next came a line of city officials, harbor masters, guild representatives, the master of the King's Gate. Each proclaimed their loyalty, each asked for confirmation of their roles. Stannis confirmed or dismissed them on the spot, guided by Davos's quiet prompts. Whenever one seemed particularly corrupt, Stannis declared he would investigate them before granting any office. Some left trembling. Others relieved. A handful of Stormland's knights approached, battered but proud. They knelt, pressing fists to their hearts. One of them, a lean man named Lord Caron, had lost an arm in the battle. He was carried forth in a makeshift sling, kneeling awkwardly. Stannis recognized his valor. "Rise, Lord Caron," he said. "You have spilled blood for me. You shall retain your lands and titles. Recover well, and if you can still bear a sword in time, you will fight for me again." "Thank you, your Grace," Lord Caron said, voice faint. He was half-conscious from the pain but determined to show fealty. Guards helped him out of the throne room. Others followed, some seeking pardons, some seeking gold. Stannis gave neither easily. He was known for harsh justice, and so the pleas for royal generosity met with stony refusal. When a group of merchants demanded reparations for goods destroyed in the wildfire, Stannis told them to address their claims to the Lannisters' seized coffers if anything was left. "I do not pay for your lost wares," he said curtly. "We all lost enough in this war. If the crown can recoup gold from the Lannisters, we will see how it might be used." That was the best he could offer. The merchants left, clearly dissatisfied but unwilling to argue. Then came a more delicate matter. A small group of lesser lords wearing Tyrell colors, green and gold, entered. They did not appear openly defiant, yet their faces were tight. One stepped forward, clearing his throat, and said, "Your Grace, I am Lord Meadows, sworn to Highgarden. I was traveling with a small retinue toward the city when word reached us that the battle was lost. We come to treat with you if you'll have it." Stannis regarded him. The Tyrell alliance with the Lannisters had famously sealed the betrothal of Margaery Tyrell to Joffrey. Clearly, that arrangement was in ashes now. What do you offer? Lord Meadows swallowed. Only that we wish for peace. My Lord Mace Tyrell was marching. But now that the city has fallen, we have no certain orders. I can send word to Highgarden that you hold the throne. Perhaps a reconciliation can be found. Stannis heard a scoff echo off the stone walls, likely from one of his stormlords. He raised a hand to silence it. Very well. I offer you safe conduct. Go to Mace Tyrell. Tell him, if he bends the knee, if he renounces his false support of Joffrey Baratheon, then I will allow him to keep his lands and titles. If not, I will march upon the Reach and break his power by force. His voice was unyielding. That is the only offer he will receive. Lord Meadows bowed low, sweat beading at his temple. Thank you, your grace. I will depart at once. Stannis inclined his head. Ser Davos, see that these men have horses and supplies enough to reach Mace Tyrell's host. They are under the crown's protection while they ride under my banner. Davos nodded, though he seemed uneasy. He had no love for the Tyrells, but he would follow orders to the letter. For hours, the procession continued. The light in the throne room turned from bright gold to dusty orange. Torches were lit, dancing flames illuminating the high pillars and stained glass windows. Finally, as the line dwindled, Ser Axel Florent touched Stannis' shoulder, quietly suggesting he rest. Stannis shook his head, ignoring the ache in his spine. A king rests last, he said under his breath. Still, the exhaustion gnawed at him. At length, the last petitioner of note came forward. A trembling septa who had apparently served in the Red Keep September. She held out a ring of keys. Your Grace, these open the sealed chambers where the Targaryen records were once kept. It has been many years since they were used, but the Lannisters' men rummaged there not long ago. I thought, perhaps you would want them. Stannis accepted the keys with a solemn nod. Knowledge was power in its way. The Targaryen records might contain genealogies, histories, secrets, some that might prove vital to stabilizing the realm or exposing further Lannister lies. You did well to bring these, he said. Return to your September, keep the peace among your sisters. She curtsied and left. At last, the throne room was empty save for a handful of guards and the flickering light of torches. Outside, the hallways were quieting, though the city beyond likely still seethed with turmoil. Stannis exhaled, the sound echoing. Ser Davos approached, voice low. You have done as much as a man can in one day, your grace. Might you rest now? Stannis slid from the iron throne, the steel scraping at his back one final time. I will rest when the city is secure and a watch has been set. But yes, he added more quietly, seeing the exhaustion in Davos's eyes. I will find my bed soon. You should do the same, Davos. Tomorrow we continue. The war is not over. He placed a hand on Davos's shoulder, just briefly, and then strode down the aisle of the throne room. Each step felt heavier. Outside, the corridors glowed with torchlight, and the swirl of night air drifted in through arrow slits. The Red Keep's gloom pressed close. King's Landing might belong to him, but it was a wounded city, full of fear. He meant to mend it, but that would not happen in a single night. He sought out a private chamber rumored to have been the Hand Solar in past reigns. It was a modest room compared to the royal apartments, but it would serve as a place to gather his thoughts. Once there, he dismissed all but one guard. He stood at the window, gazing out over the dark shapes of King's Landing. Flickers of torches dotted the streets, and far away he could see the glow of braziers near the walls. The stink of death and char still hung on the breeze. He wondered how many corpses littered the beaches downstream, how many families wept in the ashes of Flea Bottom. This was the cost of kingship, to burden one's soul with the ledger of the dead. He dozed in a chair, armor still on, cloak draped around him. An hour or two might have passed. He wasn't certain, when a commotion at the door awoke him. His guard stepped aside, letting in a figure swathed in red robes. Melisandre. The red woman's presence filled the space like a sudden blaze. He stiffened, blinking as he tried to shake off the haze of half-sleep. Where have you been? His voice was harsher than he intended. She lowered her hood, revealing hair the color of living flame. Her red eyes gleamed in the torchlight. At prayer, your grace. The night was full of Lawloress power. I gave thanks for our victory and asked for guidance in the struggles to come. He studied her pale face, searching for signs of deception. Melisandre always spoke with an otherworldly confidence, and sometimes he suspected she did see glimpses in her fires. Whether it was divine or trickery he could not say, but the results had often aligned with her prophecies. The victory was bought with the blood of my men, not illusions, he said, rubbing at his brow. She inclined her head. All things happen according to the Lord of Light's design. You are Azor Ahai reborn, my king. Your triumph is the realm's destiny. He nearly scoffed but held his tongue. How many times had she spoken of Azor Ahai, the hero reborn to drive darkness from the land? She insisted Lightbringer was a magical blade, yet the sword felt like ordinary steel to him, well-forged, yes, but no more. I will not debate prophecy with you tonight, Melisandre. We have the city. That is enough. It is the beginning, she corrected gently, stepping closer. A great darkness grows in the north beyond the wall. You must prepare. The Iron Throne is your seat, but the true battle lies further still. He frowned. I know of the troubles in the north. Ned Stark's bastard leads the Night's Watch, the wildlings gather, or so rumor says. But that is a matter for another day. Her red lips curved in a faint smile. It will come sooner than you expect. The dead walk, your grace. The long night is not mere history. Trust the fire. He gritted his teeth. I have a realm to subdue. Let me first secure it from mortal threats. Then we shall see about shadows in the snow. Of course, my king, she said with a small inclination of her head. But do not forget you are the chosen champion of the Lord of Light. All your victories serve a greater purpose. The defeat of King's Landing is but a candle against the darkness that stirs. He stared at her for a time, weighed down by the gravity of everything she implied. At last he said, leave me. I must sleep. Tomorrow, gather your disciples if you will, be you? Keep them from terrorizing the faithful of the Seven. I have no desire to stoke a riot among the city's masses. She bent her head in a gesture that was almost a bow. As you command. Then she swept from the room, crimson robes trailing like fire in her wake. Stannis leaned against the table, letting out a breath that felt like a hiss. The tension between them was palpable, a tether that bound them by destiny or folly. He reminded himself that it was through her urgings and counsel that he had been emboldened to press his claims so forcefully. He had come this far. Yet he still felt uncertain about her visions of doom. The others, White Walkers, Whites, these were tales from the Dawn Age, the realm of legend. But the ravens from the north had told of bizarre sightings. Jon Snow had reached out to any who would listen, asking for aid. Perhaps there was some truth in it. He could not think on it now. His eyes were heavy. Collapsing onto the bed in the corner, he let his eyes close, the sounds of the city drifting through the open window. When next he woke, dawn was just a hint of gray light. A cock crowed in some yard below. Stannis rose stiffly, every muscle protesting. He splashed water on his face from a basin, wincing at the cold. A quick glance out the window showed the city stirring, columns of smoke rising from scattered cook fires, the sprawl of wooden rooftops. The taste of ashes lingered in the air. He donned fresh clothing under his breastplate, letting a squire strap his greaves. The surcoat he pulled on bore his personal sigil, a crowned stag in flaming heart, an emblem that marked him as a servant of Lawler as well as the rightful Baratheon king. He still felt a twinge of discomfort at how closely it tied him to Melisandre's faith, but the symbol had struck fear into his foes at the Blackwater. Now it was a sign of victory. Another day of labor stretched before him. He had to see to the keep, the prisoners, the gold cloaks, the city starving. Then, if time allowed, he would address his next moves in the wider war. And Joffrey. He should question the boy, at least to glean some final confirmations of what had transpired with Ned Stark's death, with Cersei's manipulations, with the rumored bastards of Robert. If Joffrey was indeed a product of incest, that sealed the Lannisters' treason. In truth, Stannis needed no further proof, but letting the realm hear the boy's confession, if such a thing could be forced, might help quell any who still claimed Joffrey was the rightful king. He emerged into the corridors to find Ser Davos waiting, face drawn. Your Grace, Davos said quietly, the city is calmer this morning. Our men have controlled the docks, the granaries. There was some looting in Flea Bottom overnight, but the gold cloaks put it down quickly enough. Stannis nodded. Well done. And the Red Keep? Any pockets of resistance? None, Your Grace. Tyrion Lannister's whereabouts remain unknown. Some say he was carried away by loyal men after taking a grievous wound. But no one is certain. Stannis frowned. We must be thorough. He's not to be underestimated. Davos agreed, will continue the search. On another matter, many lords who were forced to flee the city under Joffrey's rule have returned. They want audience with you. hoping to regain lost property or claim seats on your council. Stannis' lips curved in a bitter line. Scavengers. I'll see them soon enough. Let them wait. Davos hesitated, then lowered his voice. There is also talk of Joffrey's fate. Some of your men, those who lost kin to the boy's cruelty, are muttering that he should be executed at once. Others suggest we hold him for ransom or use him as a bargaining chip against Lord Tywin. Stannis stiffened. Ransom. Bargaining. These are the ways of lesser men. I want the realm to see justice served. Joffrey is no rightful king. If he is indeed Cersei's bastard by her brother, that is treason. I would not have the realm think me squeamish. Yet, he trailed off, remembering how the boy had trembled in the throne room, more child than monster. I must speak to the boy myself before passing sentence. Davos pressed his lips together. As you say, your grace. When will you do so? Stannis exhaled. Take me to him. Now. They left the royal apartments, descending into the bowels of the Red Keep. Torchlight flickered on damp stone. Guards bowed as the king passed, their new tabards bearing the crowned stag. Deeper they went, down twisting steps, until they reached a corridor of cells behind iron bars. A pair of knights stood sentinel. The corridor reeked of stale air and unwashed bodies. At the end of the passage, in a cell slightly larger than the others, Joffrey Baratheon huddled on a cot of straw. The door was latched tight, and 2 more guards kept watch from within arm's reach. Joffrey's royal finery was gone. He wore a plain tunic, rumpled and stained, and his face was drawn, lips chapped. The boy looked up sharply at the sound of boots. When he recognized Stannis, terror flashed in his eyes. Stannis stood just beyond the bars, Davos at his side. He studied Joffrey without speaking for several heartbeats. The Child King was younger than Stannis' daughter, Shireen, though older by about a year. Yet in posture and attitude, Joffrey seemed far less a child than a cornered animal. At last, Stannis spoke, voice cold. Joffrey, do you know why you are here? Joffrey swallowed, trying to muster that old arrogance. His voice shook. I am the king. You have no right. My grandfather. You are no king. Stannis cut him off quietly. I have taken this city. Your mother is a prisoner. The throne is mine. If your father were truly Robert Baratheon, you would be my nephew, a boy I might have protected. But I have reason to believe you are no Baratheon at all, the product of incest, which means your claim was a lie. Joffrey's cheeks splotched red, tears threatening. Treason, he spat in a thin voice. You won't get away with hurting me. The people love me. They cheered me. They cheered because they had no choice, Stannis said, letting anger seep into his tone. You had Ned Stark executed on the steps of the Great September. You tormented his daughter. You allowed your mother to run the realm like her own fiefdom. The people starved while you played a king. You lie. Joffrey's voice broke. That traitor Stark. Stannis slammed a hand against the bars, rattling them. Joffrey flinched violently, backing up. Even Davos's eyes widened at the sudden rage. But Stannis forced himself to remain in control. Ned Stark was an honorable man. He was no traitor. You, boy, are the traitor, if not in name then in your actions. Your mother used you as a puppet, and you took pleasure in cruelty, so I've heard. Joffrey's lip trembled. For a moment he looked on the verge of blurting denials, but then something in him shifted. He sank to his knees, tears streaming. Please don't kill me. I didn't know. My mother always said I was Robert's son. I swear it. I didn't ask for any of this. Stannis regarded him with a dispassionate gaze. Perhaps you did not, but you are not innocent. Too many have suffered at your hands. The realm begs for justice. The only question is whether your head will roll or if some lesser sentence is warranted. The boy sobbed, shoulders shaking. It was pitiful and ugly in its sincerity. Stannis felt no triumph in it. He stood there, letting the boy's cries fill the narrow corridor. At length, Joffrey managed a few halting words. I'm sorry. I'll do anything. I'll be your hostage or a page. I'll never claim the throne again, I swear. Just don't kill me. Stannis' jaw clenched. He had once sworn to uphold justice, to protect the realm from false kings. By law, Joffrey should be executed for treason, the same penalty Ned Stark had faced. Yet the boy's terror was genuine. Would killing him truly bring peace, or just more bitterness and vengeance? He turned to Davos. In the Onion Knight's eyes, he saw the reflection of his own doubts. Execution was the simplest route, but might it be more prudent to keep Joffrey as a living testament to Lannister wrongdoing? Or to leverage him if Tywin sought to continue the war? Stannis had no illusions that Tywin would sacrifice everything for Joffrey, but the old lion might still try to rescue his blood. He faced Joffrey again, voice low. I have yet to make my decision. Pray that the gods, whichever gods you believe in, grant me wisdom. Until then, you remain here. If you conspire to escape, if you harm any guard, if you so much as speak ill of the new king, I will end you without a second thought. Do you understand? Joffrey nodded frantically, tears dripping off his chin. Why yes. Yes, I understand. Stannis stepped back, turning on his heel. Davos followed. The guards swung the corridor gate shut behind them. As they ascended the winding stairs, the echoes of the boys' sobs trailed them. Once in the upper halls, Davos spoke in a low voice. He is but a boy, your grace. Stannis' reply was curt. A boy with blood on his hands. The realm will demand an answer for his crimes. I will not spare him out of pity. But it may be that we can find another use for him. They emerged into daylight. The hush of the morning had faded. King's Landing was coming alive. Stannis began planning the day's council session in his head: the war, the city's governance, the supply lines, the possibility of Tywin's approach, the uncertain loyalty of the Tyrells, the North's self-declared king. The realm was a tapestry unraveling at every corner. And yet he, Stannis Baratheon, was now seated at its very center, forced to weave these threads into something resembling unity. He marched toward the council chamber. On his way, he paused at an open gallery that looked over the yard, where ranks of soldiers stood listening to commands from their officers. His banner flapped in the gentle breeze, the crowned stag wreathed in flame. He saw among those ranks men who had once flown the Sun-Ant Spear of Dorne, or the Lion of Lannister, or even the Rose of Tyrell. After last night's battle, all were weary, battered, their allegiances shifting in the face of the city's new master. He thought of Robert, the brother who had claimed this very city decades ago, who had ended the Targaryen dynasty. Now Stannis had ended the line of Lannister kings, if it had ever truly begun. He stood there a moment, letting the sun warm his face, feeling that bittersweet mixture of triumph and burden. The city was his. The future was unwritten. He would wage war if forced. He would mete out justice, braving the hatred of those who clung to the lion's cause. He would hold the throne by force of will because no one else had the right to it. And should the realm demand more of him, should the whispered darkness in the north prove real, he would meet that threat as well. For Stannis Baratheon was not a man to flinch from duty, no matter how heavy its cost. He let the moment pass. Then he turned away from the gallery and continued on, cloak swirling behind him, the burdens of a broken realm carried on his resolute shoulders. This was how a king lived, and how he would die, if need be, clad in iron and unyielding to the end. And though the Iron Throne might cut him as it had cut so many before, he would endure it. Westeros had a new king, and it would learn, in time, that Stannis Baratheon was as unbending as the steel from which that throne was forged.